I will introduce myself. I am Clemi Pizzilla with PMD Alliance, and I have my coworker Samantha. Say hi, Samantha, so they know who you are.
Oh.
And Samantha will be helping us today during the program. Welcome to our first Rural Reach live stream on addressing the barriers to DBS access. These programs are offered to give you an understanding of all the available treatments, and our program today is offered in partnership with our friends from Abbott. Let's get started, and we're going to go over some housekeeping items first. This program is being recorded, and you will have access to it later, and you will be able to share it with your friends and family if necessary. We have also enabled the subtitles, and you can toggle that on or toggle that off. And the way to control that is on the More button. That is the 3-dot ellipsis at the bottom of your screen. And you can click on that. And you can turn on the subtitles if that is how you want to experience today's program. And while you are on that menu section, we invite you to open up your chat. That is the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. And that is where you can ask your questions to our guest speakers throughout today's program. And that is also where you can tell us where you're connecting from in the world. Go ahead and tell us you're connecting from Maryland, from Calvert County, or from Prince George's County. I am in Maryland, and as well as my coworker Samantha. And if you have any technical difficulties with your audio or video, please send Samantha a message and she will be able to help you. And please, to avoid any disruptions, try to keep your microphone on mute. And I see some messages there telling us hello, Tracy from California and from North Dakota. Oh yes, Salomons, Maryland. I know exactly where that is. Thank you, everyone. So let's get started. Today, we are going to hear from 2 movement disorder specialists. They will be discussing symptoms you might be experiencing in Parkinson's and approved treatment options. Here at PMD Alliance, we feel that the more we know about your disease and all the treatment options available to you, the better you can advocate for yourself or for your loved one. The information gives you more control, and we feel it's important for you to be educated and an active participant in your care. What we hope for you today that you will gain from this program is a better understanding about what is happening to your disease and understanding a treatment option that you can discuss with your doctor later on. Please allow me to welcome our guest speakers today. We have Dr. Falconer. He's the director and a movement disorder specialist at Innova Parkinson's and Movement Disorders in Virginia. Dr. Falconer is also an assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine. And then we will have Dr. Usha, who is board certified in neurology and is a fellowship trained movement disorder specialist in St. Louis, Missouri at Burns Jewish Hospital. So let's get started. Dr. Falconer, thank you for joining us. And please tell me what topics we're going to be talking about today. I think you're still on mute, Doctor.
Yeah, so because we're not hosts, we can't unmute ourselves. So it's that little feature of the webinar. So I was stuck. That's okay. Samantha came to the rescue and unmuted, which is awesome. Thank you, Samantha. So welcome everybody, and thank you for giving us some time on your Thursday evening to have a very important conversation regarding Parkinson's disease, and specifically something that we see all too common in our clinic and in the world today. And that is that it is actually very rare that a patient with Parkinson's disease will see a specialist like me. I don't know if you know it, but statistically across the United States, only about 28% of patients with Parkinson's disease actually see a movement disorder specialist. Beyond even that, about 30% of patients, some studies say up to 40%, of persons living with Parkinson's actually get their care from primary care, from an internist or a family practice doctor. Now, to Dr. Uche and I, that seems like just a crazy number, because in the world of specialty medicine, outside of neurology, we always try to fight and push for the most specialized person to help us. Let's say you go see your internal medicine doc and they say, oh, I think you have a GI problem. You would probably seek out a gastroenterologist, right? Or you go see your internist and they say, I think you have a cardiac problem or heart problem. You'd see a cardiologist. Well, that's not necessarily true in the world of Parkinson's disease. And what that's done is set up this paradigm across the United States where folks are languishing in therapies and treatments that are in some ways behind on their times. And people tend to accept how they're functioning as the best they could do, when in reality, there's many, many potential opportunities to help every day in your life to be better. And the challenge is the person who needs to help you with that is a specialist who treats Parkinson's disease every day. As we'll talk about today, the beautiful part of what we do is that as of today, if you don't know it, we have 23 medications that are indicated for Parkinson's disease and 4 technologies that have all meaningfully been created to meaningfully help patients' quality of life. But a lot of patients don't access that because the access barriers that are everyday apparent in the world of Parkinson's disease are glaringly apparent. Everything from distance to travel to time to cost to scheduling, you name it, we're going to talk about it today. And so that's the topic of our talk today. And Dr. Uche is joining me. We are going to be a tag team in this and bouncing back and forth. Samantha, you might want to unmute Dr. Uche because you have the master unmuting button. But today we're gonna have a good conversation with you, and we're gonna try to do it in about a 30 to 40 minute time frame so that we can be sure to have time to answer questions. Now, while we're going, please feel free at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat button. Please feel free to put into the chat any questions that come up, and at the end we will of course dive through them. So let's jump to it. Access is a big issue. Access is limitation. Actually, do you mind going back a slide? Access is the thing that holds patients back in many ways from really doing their best every day with Parkinson's. So we're going to tackle this topic in the next 40 minutes by going through what you see on your screen. So we're going to start by setting that groundwork about Parkinson's itself. How common is it? How much of a need out there is it? Then we are going to talk through, I lost it, about advanced therapies, and we will then dive into the historical barriers, not only to DBS access, but to access to specialty care as a whole. Because while this topic and our talk today is really going to focus on that wonderfully miraculous technology of deep brain stimulation and how poorly accessible to a lot of communities and territories that it is, the barriers that are present in DBS are also present in clinical care. And then we're going to talk through what we as a community of specialists are doing, what we should be doing, and what we're trying to do to bridge these barriers to access and improve awareness and education, and how research plays into that. And we're going to try to do all of that in a glorious 45 minutes. I think we can do it. Okay, next slide. So we're going to start with that very initial fundamental question as how common is Parkinson's disease? Next slide, please. So I don't want this number to make anyone worried. It's not intended to do that. But in the United States today, we are treating about 1 million people with Parkinson's disease. Every month on average, we're diagnosing around 60,000 people in the United States with a condition called Parkinson's. It is the second most common neurodegenerative condition outside of Alzheimer's. And you are not making it up that, yes, more people around you are getting it. You are hearing about it more. That trajectory of our diagnoses are going up. Now that trajectory is going up for a number of reasons. Number one, in the you have about 5% lifetime risk of getting Parkinson's disease. And again, every year we're diagnosing about 60,000 people, but the average age of onset of Parkinson's disease is 65, ballpark. So if we are talking about patients around the age of 65 or older, and you're talking about 1 million people in the US, all of a sudden that million becomes a lot more pronounced because we're bringing it into a smaller age range. On top of that, the baby booming generation is hitting that age range, so there are more people. So there are more people being diagnosed with Parkinson's. People are living longer. We're doing better at treating other chronic conditions. And there are other factors that are involved too, but it all adds up to the simple fact that more people are being diagnosed than ever. And because of that, the message of hope is that you, as a person living with Parkinson's or being a care partner in the world of somebody living with Parkinson's, you are not alone. There are millions of people across the United States going through what you're going through every day. There are millions of people having a common presence of issues during the day, a common experience. And so take a sense of solace from that and a sense of hope, because that's the beauty of PMD Alliance and what we try to do all the time. And that is that community is a really powerful thing. And that when we come together, we realize that these numbers aren't a scary thing. They're instead a reminder that we as physicians need to work harder to educate and to become accessible, because there are so many people out there that are just falling behind and accepting good enough as the best they can be. And that's not okay. Dr. Uche and I didn't go into medicine to leave people behind, right? So how do we help this population? Well, it starts with opportunities like this to come together and talk. Next slide. Samantha's got it. Yes, touchdown. Okay, so the demographics of Parkinson's, I hinted on this, and I like this picture. We've started using this more. The picture that I hate, and I think everybody on this call remembers it, is the drawing of the little old man hunched over and shaking. Sonia, who's our outreach coordinator, is on this call. She's probably laughing to herself right now, because if we had a dartboard in our clinic, we'd probably put that drawing on it and throw darts at it. But it's everywhere. But that's not Parkinson's disease today. That was the drawing of someone with Parkinson's back when Dr. Parkinson first identified the shaking palsy 200 years ago, right? 1800s. Parkinson's disease today is what you see on your screen. It's everybody. It's the people in your community. It's the guy at church who has to be delivered communion to his seat, as well as the person who's climbing the rock wall and hiking Mount Kilimanjaro, right? Parkinson's disease affects all of us, regardless of demographic, age, or beyond. And that idea that Parkinson's is only that person suffering in a way that everybody sees is dishonest, because most people with Parkinson's have relatively good control of their symptoms, but are still accepting limitations and suffering in silence. So the important message there is that our community is important, and it's important that we identify friends to support, because everybody's going through their own journey and suffering in their own ways that we can help. Now, there is a genetic component to Parkinson's disease. Many people are always worried about the inheritability of Parkinson's. Well, if you haven't heard it, I'll be the one to tell you that classically Parkinson's disease is not a condition that's inherited. It classically does not run in families. So that worry of, oh, am I going to give this to my children? For most people, we can say definitively no. In fact, if the lifetime risk of Parkinson's is 5%, and you look at the population of Parkinson's as a whole, having a first-degree relative with Parkinson's adds 1% to your lifetime risk, so a negligible amount. Now, that's not true for everybody. There's always an exception to a rule. There are certain genetic Parkinsonian syndromes that do run in families, but that tends to be the exception, not the norm. And people always want to know, okay, how did I get Parkinson's disease? How did this thing pick me? Well, the first thing I always tell them is, well, take a deep breath. You're going to be okay. Remember, you got a condition that is really just a chemical deficiency. We can, in many ways, fix that. This isn't a structural problem like a stroke where the damage is done and good luck. This is a chemical problem. And thankfully, we have great tools to try to give you that chemical back. But you got it. It happened. And it tends to happen, we at least accept nowadays, that it's a combination of a genetic predisposition. So something in your genetics puts you at risk for it, not inherited, but just how you're built. And then that intersects with an environmental factor of some kind that triggers it to become active on average around age 65. And And we have a lot of evidence to this. In fact, the government and the VA has even admitted that those that were exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam have a much higher predilection for Parkinson's than the average population. And by the way, if you're out there and have been in Vietnam and have Parkinson's, you should fight for service-connected status because the VA should give it to you, in case you didn't know that. There's also a big swath of the farmland in the middle of California, the great breadbasket of the West, that if you grew up in that area, you have a statistically higher lifetime chance of getting Parkinson's than the rest of the US. The idea being that 100, 200 years of pesticides going into the groundwater increases that area's risk of overall lifetime Parkinson's disease. But at the end of the day, we can't do anything about that, right? Our genetics are our genetics. The environment, for many ways, is our environment. So then what do we do about it? How do we manage our Parkinson's disease, and how do we do it better? And for that, if I had a baton, I'd pass it back to Dr. Uche.
All right, next slide. Oh, there we go. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Faulkner. As you've heard, my name is Muiza Uche. I'm a movement disorder specialist in St. Louis, Missouri. And deep brain stimulation is what I do primarily. So this is kind of advanced therapies in Parkinson's is my wheelhouse. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation here. We'll try to keep it moving. So as I think about the management of Parkinson's disease, I really think about how do we treat any disease? The first thought that we all should have is how do we make it stop? How do we turn back the clock? How do we make the disease itself better? We don't have that answer yet, but boy, we're working on it. We're working on potential therapies to stop progression, potential therapies to reverse progression, but those aren't yet ready for prime time, as one of my mentors likes to say. And so the next thing we think about when disease-modifying therapies are not available or don't help the symptoms is how do we make people's lives better? And when we think about making people's lives better, if you look at the majority of medicine, that's what we do. There's areas of medicine where we have cures. We have cures in cancer. We have cures in infectious disease. And a lot of medicine, though, is actually in the management of disease and helping people have better lives, longer lives, and better quality of life. And one of the good things about Parkinson's disease is that for a long time, we have known medical and non-medical ways to help people live better, live longer, and stay independent. What we are learning more and more is diet does play a role, just like our mothers told us back when we were kids, what you eat matters. And it seems like those same diets that we were told about, those heart-healthy diets, tend to be those that help people with Parkinson's disease do better longer. Those diets that are heavy to some degree in those fruits and vegetables help people. We don't know yet if they truly prolong life and help the disease process, but we know that people who eat better do live longer and live better. And so we encourage people to do so. In addition, it helps with symptoms like constipation, which, as we know, is maybe one of the first symptoms in Parkinson's disease. And then the other thing that my physical therapy colleagues always make sure that I mention when I talk to patients is exercise, exercise, exercise. And it doesn't seem like it matters what kind of exercise you do, whether you are doing Tai Chi and yoga, which, by the way, are not as low impact as I thought they were after I actually did them, or you're a competitive cyclist or boxing. All of those exercises, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, seems to help people do better longer. One, in helping the symptoms themselves. People tend to be less stiff, less slow, feel better, and respond better when they have issues, have better balance when they're doing exercise. And so that's one of the first things I push for people, even before we start medical management of their Parkinson's disease, that exercise has to be a lifelong thing. And when we look at animal models of Parkinson's, animals that are exercised live longer, do better. And when we look at their brain cells, their dopaminergic neurons are saved longer than those that don't exercise. So that's some indirect evidence that exercise actually may be disease modifying. And so that has to be, for everybody, at every stage of illness a part of what you're doing with your Parkinson's disease. Eventually, most patients with Parkinson's disease need medical management. When I think about medical management of Parkinson's disease, I think Dr. Faulkner actually laid this out quite well, that this is a chemical disease, a neurotransmitter disease. Well, the thing that people understand because they've either had a relative or a friend is diabetes. And when I teach students and I teach residents, I teach them that Parkinson's is neurodiabetes. There's a missing chemical, neurotransmitter. And if we give you that chemical neurotransmitter, people do better. Or if we give you medications that help you or behave like that neurotransmitter, then people do better. And so those are the medications that we've got. You know, it is, while Dr. Faulkner said we've got 23 medications approved, we indeed celebrate that. But we also need to be kicked in the rear to some degree to get medications that have different mechanisms. Because what we've been working with is the same mechanism. Now, one could say and should say, we do that because it's the best mechanism for the treatment of the symptoms of Parkinson's. It replaces what you're missing. What other mechanisms should there be? But I think there's probably some better ways to think about how we stabilize the system to help people do better. And so people continue to work on better medical management for Parkinson's. But currently, we have great medications that do help people to do well for a long time. But as many of you in this room know, those medications don't come without side effects. Those side effects can be motor side effects, so dyskinesias, or it can be non-motor, so things like lightheadedness when you stand up, or even fainting. Things like impulse control problems, things like fatigue, nausea, and various others that limit our ability to give you more medicine, that result in us having to think about a different way to treat Parkinson's disease. Now, the good thing is that, as Dr. Faulkner started at the beginning of this, is one of the miracles in treating Parkinson's disease happened a while ago now. It's 25 years since deep brain stimulation has been approved. But deep brain stimulation has indeed been a boon to the way in which we treat people with Parkinson's, because it's a different mechanism and helps people do better, longer, and have better quality of life. In addition, we are hopeful to have more surgical therapies and an armament for treating Parkinson's disease in the coming future. Next slide. Now, hearing about these advanced therapies, we should all be excited. But one of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, what am I a candidate, and when should I be considering one of these advanced therapies? And for that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Faulkner. Next slide.
Thank you, sir. So to answer that question, which is always a great question, I always first bring up the idea of, do we even need to use the term advanced therapies? It kind of bothers me a little bit, because advanced to me sounds like in stage, late, go to this when when everything else fails and we need to try to do something to recover some bit of function. And we've been calling these advanced therapies for as long as they've been around, but I think we need to try to change that lingo, that vernacular, to be more something like, technological therapies, or just different tools. Because at the end of the day, the medicines we have, the technology we have, are all just tools that are trying to go to the same place to do the same thing. And I find far too often that we wait far too long to even start the conversation about these therapies, because of access, which we'll talk about, because of education, and because of just demystifying the mystique of these therapies, right? In the United States today, with deep brain stimulation, for instance, the average time from diagnosis that we implant DBS is 12 to 14 years, 12 to 14 years. As you'll see later on, it's indicated after only 4. That's a huge gap in the life of a person living with Parkinson's. That's the difference between waiting until you're 80, or not 80, that's too late, 75 or 77 to start thinking about this, versus identifying that there's a problem earlier, that you're choosing to not do things because of the limitations of your therapies, and then talking about this. Because we're in the business, and that's why Dr. Uche and I love DBS, we're in the business of restoring function and getting people back out there when they're at their best to live their best life, instead of waiting on and on and on. Because, and I'm sure Dr. Uche has this conversation all the time, Every person we do DBS on, the vast majority, the first thing they tell us after this is amazing is, I wish I would have done it earlier, right? So what you have to realize about these therapies is that they work, right? We wouldn't be doing them if they didn't. But to take that effect and put it into the context of your journey with Parkinson's. And so to do that, I want you to look at the graph on your screen. And this graph is just trying to show us how Parkinson's disease changes over time. And what I want you to realize is that this bar in the middle, see this vertical line going up and down? That's actually the time of diagnosis. That's when you go to the office of whoever it may be with symptoms and they say, I think you got Parkinson's disease, right? But if you notice, that bar is in the middle. So by the time you're diagnosed, you're already a good way into your journey with Parkinson's. You just didn't realize it. And this tells us a couple of things. Number one, that there are symptoms that occur years or even decades before a diagnosis. And that's to the left, right? Well, not left, right, but left, correct, right? The great right thing. The classic story goes that we have a patient who comes in for diagnosis, and we first say about the symptoms, and we ask, okay, how's your sense of smell? And most patients will say, oh, my sense of smell has been terrible for 5 or 6 years or longer. I used to paint houses, so I guess I got exposed to chemicals, right? And then we ask, what about constipation? Are you having issues with frequent bowel movements and having issues going to the bathroom? And the vast majority of people say, oh yeah, constipation's been a problem for some time. And then the wife or husband laughs and says that they have the plumber on speed dial for the moment when everything catches up, right? And then we'll ask, how's your sleep? And patients will usually say, ooh, my sleep's a little rough. And then the partner usually laughs and says, yeah, and once a week you fight a bear in your sleep and you have very active dreams. So that triad, an absence or reduce of sense of smell, constipation, and a REM behavioral disorder, talking in your sleep, tends to predate diagnosis from anywhere from 5 to 15 years. And so the theory is, remember, it's just a chemical deficiency. You're a car that's otherwise running relatively fine, but you have no gas in the tank. And when that light comes on is when the symptoms come out, right? So the idea is the tank's full and it starts dropping slowly over time, the dopamine levels. And just to pick a number, it drops 20% and the sense of smell goes away because the olfactory bulbs that deal with smell are very sensitive to dopamine. And then it drops to 30 or 40% down and constipation occurs because the gut is actually a heavily innervated neuronal structure. There's as many neuronal connections in your gut as in your brain, if you didn't know that. And if Parkinson's disease slows things down, it slows the gut down. And then you're at 50% down and the REM behavioral disorder happens, some depression kicks in. And then when that level of dopamine hits about 60% down is classically when people get the movement symptoms associated with Parkinson's and they're diagnosed. The important thing to take from that is that it takes 15 years or so to get 60% down. So the progression from diagnosis onward tends for most people to be very slow, very gradual, and we like to call it a glacial pace. Parkinson's is not something that changes on a dime. It's not something that you wake up and all of a sudden you can't walk and move. We are watching things change very slowly in concert with you getting older. And so to treat this properly, we have to treat you for today. We're not going to talk about what's to come. We're not going to talk about the people that you saw in the support group who worried you, or the guy at church. This was a lady this morning who was very worried she was going to become that. You are your own journey with Parkinson's. Your pathway is your own. You cannot let outside influences make you think something is going to happen because we don't know. We have to treat you for where you are on your journey today. And that means viewing this as somewhere along this curve where your dopamine level is coming down. And so what does that mean? That means things change over time. That means how we approach your condition needs to be as dynamic as you are. And that means that as time progresses, we need to respond appropriately to the limitations in your day. Now that starts with you having the courage to talk to us about those limitations. And so I encourage everybody to make that list and bring up the things that are holding you back in your day, because unless we're addressing those, we're not really trying to fix your Parkinson's disease. Whether you're at this gray bar or 2 feet in when you're fluctuating during the day, we need to try to stabilize things and give you the best care you can. Now, the question of do I need advanced therapies is a very independent and personal thing because everybody has a different journey to this. But what I tell folks is this, and I'd be interested in Dr. Uche's opinion as well. Of course, we're all here. We talk about advanced therapies when people start to fight against their medication, when it stops being easy. Because at the end of the day, you feel better because the medicine's kicking in and your dopamine level is filling up. You're feeling worse during the day. You're having off periods for most people because the medicine is wearing off. We're not able to give you dopamine back at that moment. And so we have all these different therapies to try to extend levodopa and give as needed therapies. But we talk about advanced therapies for folks that are fluctuating during the day, that are choosing not to do things because of those fluctuations. And we're just adding more and more therapies, and it's just not fixing the inconsistency of their day. And that's the person that we start talking about advanced therapies for no other reason than the limitation of most people's day is the consistency of their medication's effect. And the advanced therapies we have do nothing more but represent a tool to bypass all of the limitations of oral medicine to go to the target, the place where the problem is, to deliver consistent, predictable therapy. And that's why people get better. What do you think, Dr. Uche? When do you guys talk about advanced therapies?
Yeah, I think you actually hit it right on the mark. You know, this is a individualized therapy. While there are pieces of evidence that help guide us with regard to how and when and with what to treat patients, we use those based on what you are telling us. And so that conversation is so much more important than the exam that I do. How you've been doing in the last 3 months is so much more important than me knocking on your knees or making you walk or doing those things, because you are the person who's going to be able to tell me what's actually happening in your life. You and your caregivers are those that love you and hang out with you most. Sometimes I have to listen to them because you won't tell me. It is such an important conversation. And so I spend the majority of the time that I'm in the room with you listening to you rather than doing exams. And so I'm asking those questions of when you're dosing your medicine, how long it takes medicine to work for you, when medicine seems like it's wearing off, and then what side effects you get from therapy. And then also, this is an important piece that sometimes we jump over, what symptoms don't get better with medication. While levodopa is indeed a great therapy for Parkinson's disease, we find that some people their tremor doesn't respond to levodopa. And we push and push the dose, and the tremor is bothersome and just doesn't respond to levodopa, and you're getting side effects that we talked about earlier that are bothersome to you. As you hit those milestones, you and I are frequently talking about some of these advanced therapies, or really other therapies to help you do better with your Parkinson's disease. So we can go on to the next slide. And the exciting thing about being in movement disorders right now is that we're actually advancing with our advanced therapies. It took a while. The only advanced therapy we had for a long time was more levodopa dosed in different ways, or deep brain stimulation, or older therapies like lesioning therapies, which are coming back around in potentially better ways or easier to deliver ways. What we're seeing now is that we're going to have more tools in our armament in how to actually treat somebody who's got Parkinson's disease for their particular constellation of symptoms that are bothersome to them. These are not quite yet ready in the United States. Therapies include continuous apomorphine injection. So apomorphine is an agonist, so a medication that behaves like levodopa. It doesn't have some of the other side effects that some of the other agonists have, although it's got its own group of side effects that we have to deal with. And definitely you can read more about those on the website. In addition, subcutaneous levodopa infusion, which you're like, it's just levodopa. Why is that better? I think we're kind of looking forward to that because it's a different way to deliver this medication that maybe doesn't result in these lows that cause problems or super highs that also cause problems, and may actually be a great way to treat people who've got Parkinson's disease. Not quite yet available yet. Call your senators and tell them, hey, FDA, keep working through this process. In addition, we already have an infusion therapy for levodopa that we know works. It's just kind of been a pain for people to use, but it does work. The intrajejunal dopamine replacement actually does work to give you that stable levodopa in your brain to help your symptoms to be better. However, nothing yet has touched from a ease of use and improvement of function that deep brain stimulation does. And we'll talk more about deep brain stimulation. And we're still looking at studies using a new technology called focused ultrasound that goes back to those old lesional therapies to potentially help particular symptoms in Parkinson's disease. You can definitely go to the PMD website to learn more about each of these exciting therapies and how they may be potentially used in the future. We can go to the next slide. And go ahead and start that video. So here's a video from Abbott that shows kind of implantation and use of deep brain stimulation. So the lead itself, or it's called a lead, but it's really a group of electrodes. A neurosurgeon implants that in a deep part of your brain, and there's a couple of places in your brain where we can put the electrodes. Then the electrode itself is connected via a connector wire to a device that sits in your chest, and we're going to see that, and that device is called an implantable pulse generator. That device sends a signal up to your brain, and that signal is specific for you to improve the symptoms that are bothersome to you, which is one of the really cool things about deep brain stimulation, is that it's adjustable in a way that helps us. You can loop that as we're talking here, in a way that helps your symptoms to be better based on your symptom profile. Your neurologist or team will help in programming your symptoms to be improved in order for you to feel better, not just by a cookie cutter method, which is what's so great about deep brain stimulation. In addition, the advances in deep brain stimulation, including the steerable technology, are allowing us now to actually stimulate smaller parts of your brain to reduce side effects and potentially improve benefits. It's been really cool so I started in deep brain stimulation, my goodness, I hate to say this because it kind of ages me, 20 years ago as a student. It's been amazing to see the trajectory in which we have grown, especially in the last 5 years, with regard to the technology and how it will help people's symptoms of Parkinson's disease. We can go on to the next slide.
And so people always want to know how it works. And I always tell folks that you got to remember with Parkinson's disease, we're dealing with a chemical problem that turns into an electrical problem that turns into symptoms. And we're spending all of our time trying to fix the chemical problem with medicine. Well, DBS lets us tackle the same pathway by going after the electrical problem. And it works sort of like those big, bulky noise canceling headphones. That's what I always tell patients. Where if you don't know it, those big noise canceling headphones work because there's a microphone on the outside that picks up the sound in the room, and it broadcasts to your ear the opposite sound wave, thus canceling it out. Well, that's all we're doing with DBS. We're putting a noise canceling headphone into the electrical problem of Parkinson's and tuning it to cancel out the noise, and the symptoms get better. And this is not a new invention. DBS has been around for a long time. It was first FDA indicated in 1996. That was far longer ago than I tend to admit. And it was first indicated for Parkinson's disease in 2002, 20 years ago. We actually discovered the technology in the late 1930s to 1950s, and it took 50 years for us to create the technology to implement what we knew worked. And it was really the late 80s and early 90s that the initial platform for DBS was born. And it first got its approval in 1996 for essential tremor, in 2002 for Parkinson's. And then there's been this arms race since 2015, where there are now 3 companies who offer deep brain stimulation devices who are all competing neck and neck on being the best in creating the best targeted therapy for you. And so this is a great time to harness the power of this technology, because it really is now the Samsung versus Apple in terms of getting the best iPhone out. The technology is so advanced now, it's crazy, and it makes it all that more fun. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to watch very quickly a video of Olson, who's going to tell us about his journey leading up to DBS and then afterwards. And then we're going to jump into that second half that we'll talk about, which is the barriers that we all run into in terms of access to advanced therapies and our clinics. Okay, if you could hit play, we can, there he goes. Uh-oh. Uh-oh, no sound. Is it just me or is there no sound? Okay, well, let's skip Olson.
Yeah, I
then.
cannot hear either.
That's okay. Well, for the sake of time, we can don't tell Olson, but we can just skip Olson. There we go. So I'll summarize Olson. He was a person who had debilitating symptoms of Parkinson's and was starting to hold him back from accessing life. And he decided to take that plunge. He trusted his team. He did DBS. And as we see with most of our patients, he was able to reduce his medication by 60 or 70% because we're replacing the short-acting pulsatile medicine with long-acting smooth electrical therapy, and he did better. Surprise. Okay, so that gives us, we made up a little bit of time because I know when you get movement disorder docs on a camera, we do tend to talk. It's part of what we love to do. So let's jump into the part that is, because if you've been around, you've heard us talk about DBS. I hope that set the ground for a little more commonality and understanding about what we do every day and why we're passionate about it. But the truth is, we are implanting people in the US at a shockingly low rate. And so now we're going to shift to talk, and this is a great parallel between just the limits of access to movement care or Parkinson's care, period. Dr. Uche, jump in and take over, lead us into the second half about our barriers.
Yeah. Thanks. So one of my other roles at Washington University School of Medicine is as the Vice Chair of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging for the Department of Neurology. In that role, I get to study, learn, and implement ways to help people get access to the care that they need, especially those that are from historically under-resourced populations. And that is one of the places where I have intersected my two roles of leading deep brain stimulation at our university and then thinking about diversity or the lack of diversity in the ways in which we treat our illnesses. We can get to the next slide. So what we have seen is that barriers do exist, which include access to care, low numbers of movement disorders doctors being present, which means that people have to travel long distances in order to come and see us because we're all clustered in big cities or large academic institutions. And then an inequity in the gender population of who gets to movement disorders care and then who gets deep brain stimulators implanted, as well as inequities in racial distributions with people of color being less represented in those who get deep brain stimulation or other advanced therapies for their Parkinson's disease. That means then that the time to a lot of these therapies is a lot longer for some people, including those that don't live close to institutions that do these therapies, leading to reduced care compared to those that live in regions that are close or tend to be dominant population or men. As the PD population grows, we know that we need to grow more movement disorders doctors, but we're not going to be able to do that and keep up with it. And so we need to think about other ways in which we can actually deliver this amazing care that we've talked about to larger swaths of the population that need it with Parkinson's disease. Jump back in, Dr. Faulkner.
Yes, sir. Yeah, if you could advance it to the next slide. Hey, you are all living out there with Parkinson's. You know someone who has Parkinson's. You know these barriers. It is, for a lot of people, a big thing to get out and see a doctor. I mean, those barriers of distance, of travel, of time are a big thing that affect, yep, go one more, right there, that affect how we are made accessible to you. And we find that the issues that we see really fit into three different categories, and they all intersect, and that's what we're going to talk about now. It's those personal barriers to care, to specialty care. It's the health system barriers. The system is not built to make it easy. And then it's the access to the care limitations, just that it's access. I mean, if we could fix access, I feel like so much of our world would be a better place, right? I mean, don't forget, for most Parkinson's patients, ambulation is a challenge, right? We are movement specialists because the issue is with movement. most of our patients, a lot of our patients coming to see us is a full day affair. It takes usually a loved one or a kid or a neighbor to take off a day to pick them up and drive them into clinic. It's dealing with the traffic. I'm in Northern Virginia. The DC Beltway is crazy. Traffic is always a thing. People's blood pressure is always up when they come into clinic. Then they have to park. They have to get out of a car that they've been sitting in for a few hours, make their way through the lobby, up the elevator, to wait in a waiting room, to wait to be into an exam room where we're always running behind. I don't know about you, Dr. Uche, but our clinic is never on time because you can tell we like to communicate. And then to have a great meeting and then do it all in reverse. So the traditional way we think about delivering care has been, in a way, a limitation. I mean, there are a number of studies out there that show this. I will re-quote to you that number, that only about 28% of patients with Parkinson's at most see a specialist like us. And there's one big study I read a few years ago. Well, it was because we did a research article that we'll talk about soon, that if you take neurology as an entire group, anybody with a neurologic condition, 20% of all patients with a neurologic problem travel outside of their hospital's region for care, 20%. And out of all those patients through all of neurology, guess what the number one diagnosis of the people who traveled was? It was Parkinson's disease. So all the Parkinson's patients have to travel the furthest to reach a specialist like us. That study actually quoted an average of 148 miles from the patient to the clinical provider. And then there was a different study that was really interesting to me about deep brain stimulation care, where if you take all the patients in the US with DBS and you map them to their provider, the average distance was over 80 miles. It was almost 90 miles. 90 miles, that's far, especially when mobility is an issue. And then there's the limitation of us, of the time that we can, if you could advance the next one, Samantha. And so that starts with, put them all up there, that works. So we'll start on, go back, sorry. So we'll start with awareness. Most people know that a movement doctor is present. Most people don't know where the local one is. And we run into people all the time because in community talks where people will say, yeah, I didn't even know that I could get a specialist in this. Well, you can. Tell all your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your cousins, tell the person at the Elks Club. You need a movement doc to be part of your team, even if you see them once or twice a year, because we do this every day. I see 80 to 100 patients with Parkinson's every week. You learn how to do this well by doing it, right? Now, a big additional barrier that we see is that it's hard to get an appointment with someone like me. In the US right now, the average time to a new visit with a movement doc is anywhere from, the range is 2 to 7 months. And on average, it's 5 to 6 months out across the US. 6 months is a long time when you have an active problem to have to wait to get help. And then on top of that, the time you spend with a doctor is really limited in our current healthcare environment. I mean, if we were all together and would raise hands, I'd probably ask who gets 10 minutes with their neurologist, and most people would say yes, right? Our clinic times are short because that's how the system is built. That's another plus of having a movement specialist as part of your team. Across the US, the average time for a neurologist to have a clinical visit is 7 minutes. Crazy, I know. Movement doc, we average 30 minutes for every visit we have. It's really important that you have one of us, but the limitation is, like Dr. Uche said, we're not everywhere. There are whole states that only have one movement doc. The state of Delaware has one movement disorder specialist for the entire state. He's a fantastic guy and I love him, but he can't see everybody in his state, right? So we need more of us, we need to be more accessible, and we have to figure out those barriers that happen to keep people from seeing us and try to bridge them. And one of the biggest is that barrier of distance and time, which is where we're going to talk about telehealth more. Telehealth has done nothing but open that world of access to us because you don't have to travel to see a specialist. Next slide. And yeah, somebody just asked about DBS. DBS is covered by all insurance. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Uche. I think I lost. Oh, there he is. Oh, my window's reordered.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi dropped out for a second, and I thought, oh no, Dr. Faulkner's gonna have to give it by himself, but I'm back.
Welcome back.
So one of the other disparities that often doesn't get talked about in Parkinson's disease care, especially with regard to advanced therapies, is that there are gender and race disparities. And so it's important for us, as we are both people who treat Parkinson's and people who advocate for people with Parkinson's disease, is that we advocate for those that are less likely to receive care. And so we need to advocate for women that they get seen earlier, they get seen more often, and get access to the same level of care as men do. And then that people of color that have been traditionally minoritized also get access to the same things. All right, we can go to the next slide, Dr. Faulkner.
The mute button. We've been doing this for 3 years, guys. You would think we'd know how to unmute ourselves. It's live TV, as they say. So this was a study that our center did during the first year and a half of the pandemic. And the numbers we want to share with you because it really highlighted not only the problems that we have in terms of access, but the potential role for telehealth to try to bridge those traditional barriers. And I know everybody out there, we're now 3 years in, and there's a heavy debate currently about the role of telehealth and how we should continue to integrate it in our world. And what I would stress to people is please, please, please never think it's either telehealth or an in-person visit. That's not how we use tools. That's not how we advance as a society and as a discipline of medicine. Telehealth is now the cat's out the bag. It's something we do and we have done a lot. It is, if nothing more, an alternative to an in-person visit when access is a problem, right? And so this was a study during it was April to December 2020, where we looked at all of the new patients that our center saw. And we were shocked that at our center during that 9-month period, we saw 1,097 new patients. Here's the wild part. The vast majority of those patients were through telehealth. It was the first year of the pandemic. We all switched to it. It was this forced experiment as to how will telehealth work with new patients, right? We're not talking about follow-ups. We're talking about we have to keep offering access even during a pandemic. How did that change how people accessed care? So it was about 90% of those patients were via telehealth, and almost 100% of those patients had never seen a movement disorder specialist before. In the group that came in person, a lot of them had, but in the telehealth group, it was extremely low. So we concluded from that the option of telehealth actually increased access to communities and people who the idea of an in-person visit, of travel, of distance, of time, of all those other impediments, meeting on your computer in your living room table, bridged it. And we saw that the distance people traveled was much less than we thought. And the concomitant medical problems was about the same. And all other things were relatively similar, except the uptake of specialty care was much higher when we offered that telehealth option for patients. And another interesting thing we saw, because traditionally African-American community is very much underserved by specialty care. If you look at the numbers, it's embarrassing how poor we are as a community of specialists at caring for that community. And what we saw through our numbers was that if we looked at the patients who accessed our specialty care, our center through telehealth, that we actually were able to see it was twice as many African-American patients through telehealth than through that group that we saw in person. And we don't know what that really means outside of that's a pretty sizable increase in access. And maybe that having a telehealth option helps to bridge some of those traditional and historic barriers that keep people from seeking specialty care through a center like ours. Okay, next slide. So what are we doing to try to improve access, awareness and access? Isn't that the big topic for today, right? Well, if anybody on this call has any ideas on how to fix it, we are all ears and we will take it and build it as well as we can, because this is a big thing. If there's 1 million people in the US and only 20% have somebody who does this every day, that's a whole lot of people who are doing their best without a good captain on the ship, right? So we have to find a way to bridge this. And we are trying to do that through all kinds of different outreach initiatives, mainly around the idea that education is key, that people live better and pursue better paths with Parkinson's when they have that candle of hope lit, that there's an option for them out there. And they're empowered with the knowledge about the options they have and the courage to go and talk to their doctor about it. And so next slide. And so what I stress to everyone is engage with the resources that are available, educate yourselves, because I promise you, you can stay on the forefront of what we're doing. And by doing that, you'll really realize when you got a bad deal and we need to push for better, right? And so PMD Alliance, they're hosting us today. Thank you guys, y'all are amazing. They offer all kinds of programs, 12 DBS specific programs they've offered since 2020. They have 2 upcoming DBS programs. Go to pmdalliance.org. There's all kinds of educational programs on DBS, on non-medical therapies, on medical therapies, on down. We like the PD Avengers. They're always a fun thing, pdavengers.com. They have great technical briefs that the World Health Organization has put out. And then, of course, we all love the Michael J. Fox Foundation, who is moving into the world of deep brain stimulation for the first time. Glad they are. They've got a great fact sheet at michaeljfox.org/deep brain stimulation. Parkinson's Foundation has good resources. And don't forget Abbott, our sponsor for today. They have great resources on their website to educate more about DBS. But it all starts with you. It all starts with having that realization that you don't have to accept good enough. And we got to educate ourselves and really fight for ourselves and be our own best advocate for better. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to transition back to Dr. Uche. What is being done to improve access? Because that's a big one.
Yeah. So I think Dr. Faulkner did a great job detailing the study that they did. You can go on to the next slide. With regard to the impact that telemedicine can do for those that have trouble with getting to the clinic, or even if you don't have trouble, just having that option as a different way to see your neurologist, to have a conversation while that neurologist gets to see you, because that's what we do as movement disorders physicians, is we see you move. That interaction is so important. And so one of the ways we want to continue to increase access is to actually make care from a remote or a distance available to people with Parkinson's disease. In earlier, we talked about the arms race of deep brain stimulation, that each of the companies is developing new and amazing technologies. And one of those things that's been developed by Abbott is remote programming. So the ability of a neurologist to be able to interact with your deep brain stimulator at a distance improves your ability to access your neurologist and to have your DBS programmed while not having to always travel to the programming center. You can start the video, and actually, hopefully it doesn't start with sound because I'm going to try to keep us moving here. So this is an interaction done by one of our colleagues at Northwestern with a patient who has Parkinson's disease while they're at home, and my colleague is at Northwestern. He's able to, actually at Rush, he's able to dial into her device. The programmer itself has a camera that shows the patient and allows then the physician to see the symptoms that they're talking about. They're talking about her tremor for the most part, and be able to change the programming in order to see how that tremor responds. He also gets to hear from her, hey, are you getting any side effects when I change your stimulation? And he gets to see whether those side effects are present. Because sometimes, I love patients with Parkinson's. You're some of the toughest people that I know. And often you can tolerate a lot of side effects, and we see them on your face, but you don't tell us. And so that ability to see you as we change that programming is so important. And that allows that physician to have that interaction while that patient is in the comfort of their home. Or hopefully, as we develop better relationships as well with your doctors that are local, that sometimes get lost when you get deep brain stimulators implanted, you could go to their office and they may not have expertise in deep brain stimulation, but they have expertise in the medical management of Parkinson's, and working together as a team gives you access to a doctor that knows you, as well as a physician or a team that knows deep brain stimulation well. So this really creates a new avenue to get access to people to get deep brain stimulators implanted, but not always have to travel miles and miles to a programming center, park in a garage that's potentially half a mile away, get on a shuttle or walk that distance to the doctor's office, and then again have to do it in reverse. This is the current status of how DBS is done, and will be more and more as we go forward. Next slide. And so the question comes up, is remote programming for DBS necessary? I think the argument is that it has become necessary. It doesn't have to be. We've programmed DBS for 25 years without remote programming, and people have done relatively well. But as you have seen, we're not getting to nearly enough people with Parkinson's disease. So we need something else. We need a way in which we can actually get people to get deep brain stimulation and be able to be programmed. And Parkinson's disease gets worse over time. So even if in the first couple of years of doing programming, you're like, yeah, Dr. Uche, I only want to come in and be programmed there. If things are getting worse, you don't always necessarily want to come in for a programming. And it would be nice. And even on those emergent situations, I've done this a couple of times. Well, I've been able to dial into somebody's DBS and see that, oh no, they turned it off by mistake, and be able to walk them through the process of turning it back on while in their programmer and teach them on that call. So all of those things, I think, make this, while not quote unquote necessary, absolutely the next armament in the way in which we treat people with Parkinson's disease. Next slide.
And the beautiful part about it is it also makes the ability to tune and just program so much easier. If you have an issue, the tremor comes out. It's not, oh, let me throw you 4 different dates in the next week or 2 that I can try to fit you in, where all those logistics all of a sudden come into play. It's, can we jump on a virtual visit tomorrow before clinic at 8:30? And it'll take 10 minutes. It's quick. You're sitting there eating your breakfast and we tune your device. It's so incredibly helpful on that paradigm of our relationship, because it gives us a really easy fallback for when we need to program things. And it's easy. There was a big study that came out that if you look at patients who were doing remote programming for DBS, over 90% said that they loved it and it worked. 9 out of 10 of them said that it made access easier and made that whole limitation of that barrier of access go away. And that same 90+% said that they would use it again. There is no question at that point that it works then. And even in that study we did, where we looked at the 1,097 new patients, when we were diving through the charts during that first year of the pandemic, when there was no deep brain stimulation option, the amount of people we programmed with DBS dropped by almost 30%. 30%. And Dr. Uche could probably agree, during the pandemic, the limited in-person visits we saw were our DBS patients and our Botox patients, because at that point we had to be with patients to adjust their device or do their injections. And we still had 30% of people who just said, I'm just going to take time off, not going to go in because of that barrier. So this is not a replacement. It's just a way to advance our entire field to make it easier for you. And that's the beauty of it. Next slide. Okay, final thing, and you can go to the next slide, and then we're going to answer our questions. Look, we were only like 15 minutes over. Clinical research, quick call out to that. Here's the fun part, everybody. 7 years ago, there was 1 device for DBS, well, 1 company. Now there are 3 and a total of like 8 devices. And it's growing by the year, it's growing by the day. Look, in the next 2 years, we're going to have 2 different subcutaneous pumps for Parkinson's disease. It's going to be crazy. We are, as a specialty, advancing light years year after year after year. So keep an ear out there, keep an eye out there. The first step was remote treatment. Now we're all moving into the world of remote monitoring. Apple Watches are amazing. They have all kinds of sensors in it. Integrating that into your DBS system and is the next step. And the research is just about. But I'll leave it at that because we have hit 8:04. Dr. Uche, any final words for our audience before we dive into some of these fantastic questions that they have posed to us?
Yeah, I've been looking at some of your questions and they're great questions. I don't want to take too much time, but to say we need to do better with getting care to you in this new patient-centered model rather than doctor-centered model. I think remote or telemedicine is beginning to address some of that. It's not going to be the end all and be all, but I think it is one of the tools in getting us there.
It's a great way to put it. Yeah, we have moved, hopefully are moving away from very prescriptive medicine to collaborative medicine, where we're a team. And it's all about talking to you about your day. And like Dr. Uche said, we spend our time listening because that's how we hear about the hurdles you're trying to overcome. But you have to be the one to bring those hurdles up to your doctor. Because if you show up and say, I'm doing great, the doctor says, oh, how are you doing? You say, I'm doing great. Most doctors will say, oh, good. And they'll go through the mental checklist and you'll be out in 10 minutes and they're going to go on to the next patient. Don't be the good patient. When you go see your doctor, say, I'm doing great, but, and then tell that doctor some of the things that are holding you back and give them that list of the things that you want to talk about that are keeping you from doing what you want to do. You have to be the advocate a lot of times, and it's our job to hopefully make that advocacy easier. But it all comes down to that courage to not be the good patient and to bring up what's holding you back. Because you'll be so surprised at the stuff that we can do to actually help. That's the fun part. Okay, guys.
And the majority of us want to hear that. So don't feel like, that's the reason you're there, is for us to act. The first thing we ask is, what's the chief complaint? We say that purposely because we actually do want to hear the complaints. They're not painful to us.
No, and you're not going to hurt our feelings. Look, there's a big study out of the Michael J. Fox Foundation of 3,500 Parkinson's patients. 90% of folks who answered that survey had off time, the enemy of Parkinson's, medicine wearing off, limitations to their day. And guess what? Only 40% of those patients actually talk to their doctor about their off time. You got to do it. I promise you that's the path to better, is realizing there's better and then talking about it.
Those are some wise words, Doctor. And we have a very active chat room there. And thank you for answering some of the questions already. But there are a few that I think it's important for us to cover. And the first one is there an age limitation for DBS?
So I'll kind of dive into this because this is a study we did. That clinical trials did have an age limit. The initial one was 70 and then 75. And so early on, people kind of behaved like those were the limits because that's what the data gave us. And so we were limited by the data. But over time, a lot of centers went ahead and started implanting it in older and older patients that were healthy. And what we found was that the risk of the procedure did not go up significantly in people as they aged. And they actually still responded to deep brain stimulation. We look at all of the parameters to make the decisions the same, but age itself is not one of those cutoffs. It really is, how healthy are you? How are you doing with your Parkinson's? And would deep brain stimulation help your symptoms without potentially making you worse? So do not think just because I'm 80, I'm not a candidate for deep brain stimulation. If you're an 80-year-old that over the last couple of years was quite active, and when medicine is working, you're quite active still. Your cognition is good. You are a candidate for deep brain stimulation, and that conversation should be had.
Thank you, Doctor, for that. It's very encouraging, and I'm sure a lot of people are happy to hear that. And let's talk a little bit about exercise. Some people are concerned that, if they are daily exercisers and they have to, stop for that period of time, the prep time, the recovery time, how would DBS affect that?
Not too much. So we have people exercising a week after the procedure. It's a big thing. It's not a small surgery. We always say it's a big one-time thing for a lifetime gain, but you don't have to just be bedbound. You go at our center, knock on wood, we keep people after the first part of the procedure overnight just to watch them. But so far in 7 years, we implant 40 people a year. We've had one person who didn't go home the next day, knock on wood. So it's the kind of thing where,
knock on wood.
Yeah, big knock on wood. My surgeon, wherever he is, just like twitched and he didn't know why, right? But the point is, you don't have to take exercise completely out. We have folks who are very active who we let them rest through the weekend, and then they go meet with one of our physical therapists who talks them through safe ways to keep moving during that time period. What do you think, Dr. Uche? Reasonable?
Absolutely. The thing that we care about is your wounds and them healing well. And so you're going to get limitations if you're a big weight lifter or you do repetitive exercises. The surgeon's going to tell you, hey, cut out those for this amount of time and modify it. But you're not bedbound by any stretch of the imagination. The day of the surgery, as you are sitting in the hospital, you're sitting up, you're potentially walking. It is really the amount of pain that you are, which is typically not very much, and your ability to have tolerated the rest of the procedure. You're home the next day, and we don't send you home with, oh no, you got to be in bed and not doing anything for days. In fact, we want you up and living your life.
That is great to hear. And you answered one of the questions already, if it was painful. So, and with exercise, we had some comments about exercise is medicine. And that is exactly what, hopefully DBS is going to help them continue doing. Another question is about dystonia. Having dystonia and tremors and rigidity on the left arm, and will DBS help with that?
Absolutely. So as we think about deep brain stimulation, we've got 2 targets, really 3 if we're thinking tremor only, that are approved in Parkinson's disease. And as we're making those decisions, we're often looking at your particular group of symptoms and making a decision on where to put the electrode based on those and your response to medication, yes or no. We tend to think that both the 2 main targets for Parkinson's improve most of the motor symptoms for Parkinson's disease and allow you to tolerate your medicine better. So if your center that you go to is like, listen, we're comfortable doing this particular target, we're not so comfortable with that other target, it's not a bad thing. Don't go, oh no, I got to go to this other place that does this target. Or make your surgeon do a different target. Let your surgeon do the thing that they're really good at, because the evidence is that they're probably not different from each other in the way in which people do over time, and that they can help most of the motor symptoms of Parkinson's. The thing that we struggle with and are still learning is walking in balance. Sometimes that gets better, and it's such a win when it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And so we always warn patients that walking in balance may not change the most from deep brain stimulation, but it may.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. And some were concerned about Medicare covering DBS.
It's covered. I mean, it's whatever your surgical copay is. It's everybody's insurance is different, but it's considered standard of care. We have a lot of folks in our area who have very good insurance. We have a lot of people who are on either Medicaid, Medicaid Advantage, or we have a lot of charity patients. We have not found a single person that the idea of out-of-pocket cost was a limiting factor. So don't let that be the reason. Pick a therapy because it makes sense and it should work out.
And talking about Medicare, during the pandemic, telehealth was covered, and now it's not across state lines.
That makes a whole lot of sense, doesn't it? Look, I'm in Northern Virginia. I've got Maryland 10 minutes that way. And probably Samantha's like 30 minutes that way, right? I can't do a telehealth visit 10 minutes that way if a patient's there because they're in Maryland, or DC is 15 minutes that way. We can't do telehealth. But if you're in Roanoke, Virginia, which is 4.5 hours that way, we can do telehealth. It is stupid. It makes no sense. It is a barrier to access, and it's just ridiculous. There are an incredible amount of people trying to fight that right now, including the American Academy of Neurology. I'm on their telehealth committee, and that's what we talk about every single time, is how do we lobby better to get rid of that stupidity. But it's purely it's a money game. It's purely a licensure thing. If you're licensed in the state of Virginia, Maryland doesn't want you practicing medicine in Maryland if you're not licensed in their state. So that's the logic behind it. It's something that's probably you're going to see changing in the next few years, because you're absolutely right. For the first 12 months of the pandemic, we could do telehealth anywhere. And I teach a lot. I do this a lot. So I developed a whole group of patients in Salt Lake and Jersey. I'm from Louisiana. So I took over my hometown's Parkinson's patients because telehealth was anywhere. And forget it, Florida, for crying out loud. Half of my patients spend the wintertime in Florida, and we would still do telehealth, right? And all of a sudden, the barrier came down, and it was one of the greatest disruptors to continuity of care and access to care that I have ever experienced in my 8-9 years doing this thing. What do you think, Dr. Uche? Did you have a similar experience with all that?
Absolutely. I would tell you to call your senator and bombard them. This is one of the places, we have lots of areas where lots of people want to fight against each other with regard to our Senate. But this is one of the places we can actually get senators from both sides of the aisle to actually care. They just need to know that this is on the top of the list, that it's not one of the bottom things that'll get taken care of later. This is a major thing for how people get taken care of going forward.
Thank you, doctors, for that. We still have a couple more questions. And if you're available, if we can take a couple more minutes to answer these questions, that would be great. There is one question.
Mr. Jenkins keeps giving us a thumbs up. So every time he gives me the thumbs up, I know we're doing the right thing.
There you go. And there is
crushed it there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So Heather asked a personal question, direct question about her DBS. She said that her programmers have tried everything for over a year. And is it possible to come see you to try something different, tuning that DBS?
Always.
Which one of us?
Yeah, either. I mean, anybody. That's the beauty of medicine. If you I mean, a second set of eyes never hurt anybody. It sometimes it just takes a new set of eyes looking at things. I don't know. We all have different experience. We all do this differently. That's the fun part. We all sit around and we're all just science nerds at the end of the day. And when we sit around and talk about this stuff, we all learn from each other because there's so many different ways to do this. That's the great joy of what I do. This isn't, I mean, I was going to say blood pressure management, but I'm sure that's nebulous too. But like Dr. Uche and I could sit and have coffee and take the same patient and go at it completely differently. And the person would get better and we would both walk away like, that's really cool, right? So never a bad idea.
Yeah, I tell my patients that if something we're doing is not working and they want to get a second opinion, they should absolutely get it and then come back and teach me, if that thing worked. And so I would tell you to absolutely get a second opinion. The access issue continues to be tough. And so some places you can get in faster than others. And that's one of the things that we're trying to work on.
Well, and to that point, be a little patient with your doctors right now. I don't know if you have realized it, but healthcare remains in a little bit of crisis. We are all understaffed and seeing volumes of patients at a higher level than we ever have. And it's due to people being educated and wanting specialty care, but also we're still dealing with folks that we haven't seen in 2 or 3 years that are coming out of the woodworks trying to catch up. So give us a little grace.
Wise words, and you got a thumbs up also, and maybe more. And let's go with the last question. And it says, why is there a time span between implanting electrodes and then doing the stimulator? And then even before the stimulator is programmed?
It's a great question, Dr.
Yeah, so I think those are actually two great questions. The second one's easier to answer than the first one. So the second, why don't you just program me right away? And there's some places that do that, but the trouble is that your brain is changing. In that time when we put the electrode in and the time when we program you, usually a month or so after, your brain is changing. There's some edema or swelling around the electrode that changes your symptoms. You may actually find that especially if you have tremor, that your tremor is gone immediately after DBS, and that may be gone for a week or 2 weeks. And so it's hard for me then to try to make your tremor go away because it's gone. And so for me to turn on your DBS in the hospital and then send you off and away, I know that those settings are not going to be your settings for forever. And when we've looked at scans of people, so CT scans serially after they've done their programming, their brain is changing. There's actually shifts that happen depending on the amount of air that enters your brain, which may mean that the electrode isn't exactly in the same place that we left it. The shifts are minute, so the change is not dramatic. And so the spot that if we were to start to stimulate immediately may not be the spot that we end up stimulating at the end. The second question, or the first question, is the harder question. Why don't you just do the whole surgery at the same time? One, it'd be a long surgery, which increases the risk of the procedure for you. And two, staging seems like it works better. Some people stage it that they do one side of the brain all at the same time, and then they come back and do the other side of the brain. There's actually data. So we published some of this a long time ago, and now it's coming back around, that stimulating one side of the brain actually helps both sides of the body. And for some people, that may be all that they need for a long time. But I typically say to people, your other side is going to become more problematic and you're going to need both sides. I'd rather go into your brain only one time. And so I prefer to do the brain implant first, let you recover for a week or so from that procedure, and then come back and do the implantable pulse generator implantation, connect everything up because that surgery requires anesthesia, and let you recover from that. And then you go home, and in 3 weeks later, we're programming your device. We found that staging tends to work better for people from both the outcomes of the procedure itself, how long you stay in the hospital, the chances for bad things to happen to you in the operating room, All of those things I think are better off if you do it in a staged fashion.
And also remember, everybody, it's not a light switch. And this is one of the things that we try to dispel, because expectations are absolutely huge when you're going through something big like this. It's very rare that somebody comes in at that month, we flip it on, we're great, they go out and live life, and that's it. Maybe a central tremor, because that's just so much easier to program, right? No, we have to spend time getting the DBS where it needs to be and lowering the medicine to where they need to be. Because remember, they all work on the same pathway. And so we tell folks, yes, we're going to get it turned on, but that's when the journey really begins. And really, you need to expect 4 to 6 months of us tweaking and tuning it to really get it good. Because there's effects from the surgery that takes 6 months or so to truly go away. There's that lowering and balancing of medicine. It takes time. But if you look at the data, like Dr. Uche said earlier, between folks who had the best medicines we could give versus that plus DBS, and there's a big study that came out of Europe with 30 years of data, the gap in every measure of quality of life that we could measure between medicine versus DBS was a mile wide after 20 to 30 years. So it works. But you got to have the courage to talk about it. And this is how we all start, by being a community and coming together to realize that there's a lot of options out there and there's a lot of hope. It's a beautiful thing.
And we hope we dispelled some concerns and fears with regard to DBS. I want to turn back around to that pain question. You know, it's a surgery, and so you're going to have some incisions, and so you can expect some incisional pain. But that typically people don't even need narcotics for. Typically, people are taking Tylenol and perfectly fine after a week from those incisions. In addition, when we turn on the stimulator, sometimes people feel a buzz, you know, and it can be a tingling that can be kind of, hey man, I didn't like that tingling, but it doesn't stay. And so don't expect that you're always going to have that sensation or that feeling, or that it's going to hurt whenever deep brain stimulation is on. If it does that, then we didn't get it in the right spot. And we actually need to think about how we program it, which is one of the cool things about the new DBS systems, because in the past I'd have to say, I need to do another surgery because that thing is in a spot that's just causing you trouble. But now we can actually think about ways in which we program that may limit that side effect. So overall, you should not be in pain from DBS. If you're in pain from DBS, we should be thinking about whether or not something is not quite right.
Yeah, and if you slip the rep $10, you get free HBO for 6 months. That's a joke.
Thank you, doctors, for such a dynamic conversation. We have some great feedback in the chat. Enjoying the conversation, very informative, and the wonderful chemistry and the wonderful information you have shared with us today. And here at PMD Alliance, we have a tradition of giving our wave of gratitude to all of you doctors for presenting, and to everyone for being here. So thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to our next live stream.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye now.